Hello and welcome to the screencast on lesson planning. The idea behind this screencast is to give you some guidance as to how to put together your lessons and to try and help you understand how the different lessons and different lesson stages come together when planning skills lessons and when planning language lessons. We're going to be using my lesson planning checklist, which is the document that you have here and that you were given before. Basically, we're going to be looking at the different stages that I have identified here. And just in a nutshell, I've put together the different stages for receptive skills lessons and the different stages for language lessons in one document so that you can have it at hand and use it as a checklist while on the course. Now, whenever you sit down to plan one of your teaching practices, make sure that you've looked at this checklist and that you have thought about the different stages. Now, let's look at stage one. It's a good idea to identify your teaching practice focus. So what you're going to be teaching, is it a skills lesson or is it a language lesson? By skills, you know that we mean reading, listening, speaking, and or writing, and by language, grammar, vocabulary, functions, and or pronunciation. Now, bear in mind that while on the course, the teaching practices that you have, the TPs, you would teach 9 times, the first time 20 minutes, then 7 40-minute lessons, and then 1 60-minute lesson at the end of the course. Now, in 40 minutes, all your TPs, the 7 40-minute TPs, you will be focusing on only one skill or one language area for your lesson, because in 40 minutes you won't have that much time to actually deliver a combined lesson, a lesson which includes listening and skills and language. Now, having said that, this lesson planning checklist is going to be looking at mainly receptive skills, so reading and listening. For speaking and writing, I will prepare different screencasts, so we're going to be looking at how to put together a reading and or listening skills lesson, or a language lesson where you are teaching either grammar or vocabulary or functions or pronunciation. So number one, identify your teaching practice focus. Once you've done that, then step 2 would be to identify the lesson framework that corresponds to the teaching practice focus, because that will determine the stages of your lesson. So we're going to be looking at receptive skills. So what are the different stages for a receptive skills lesson, reading or listening? After that, we'll look at language. Now, in receptive skills lessons, we can say that there are 3 main stages. So we have pre-skills, as you can see here, pre-skills stage, while skills stage, and post-skills stage. Okay? Now, let's start by looking at the pre-skills stage. And as you can see here, leading and warmer are 2 stages or 2 activities that are common to either receptive skills lessons or language lessons. And that the reason for that is that any lesson that you deliver at the beginning, there should be a leading and a warmer, so as to prepare students for what's coming next, regardless of the fact that it may be a receptive skills lesson or a language skills lesson. So in your pre-skills stage, in a receptive skills lesson, reading or listening, you would have a lead-in, which is used to introduce students to the topic of the lesson. where you set up the context. The context is vital, is essential, is paramount, and because that would create basically the topic, the theme, the canvas, if you want to put it that way, where everything else is going to go on, is going to go up onto. So you can set the context via a visual, or telling them a short story, or where they listen to a short story or a short listening, or something along those lines. It is not a task, but simply a way to lead them into or set the context. So a picture, a sound, an anecdote, something along those lines, to activate schema or schemata about the context, to make to get the juices flowing. You could make them make predictions, or evoke key vocabulary. As you can see, there's an asterisk here that is related to pre-teaching vocabulary here, so we will look at that in a minute. As Field says in the lead-in, what would the listener or reader already know in real life before the speech event began? So, for example, if you're talking about your lesson is about a text about food at a specific restaurant and how they talk about the restaurant, then one way of having a lead-in is showing a famous restaurant that students can identify, and then the warmer could be giving them some questions to discuss, or something to do related to that picture. For example, when was the last time you went to a restaurant, or what is your favorite restaurant, or where is your favorite restaurant and why? So that would get the topic, get them thinking about the topic, and get the juices flowing. So the warmer is usually a task, as the word implies. So to warm them up and make them think or do something about the context. Right, the next step would be in the Preskills to address vocabulary that may be difficult for them in the listening or reading text. Now, pre-teaching vocabulary is a bit of a controversial area, because there are lots of people and trainers that say, no, you shouldn't pre-teach vocabulary. Some people say, yes, you should pre-teach vocabulary. Now, my MA dissertation was basically about this, and I got a merit for my MA, and I can tell you that research says that there is a place for pre-teaching vocabulary in receptive skills lessons. Now, it may be here, or it may be done in different ways, not necessarily in one specific way. The important thing, what really matters, whether we should pre-teach it or not, is that if we do, then it should be vocabulary that is absolutely necessary for students to be able to carry out the reading or listening tasks. It's not just random vocabulary. It's not all the vocabulary that you think or that we think they are not going to understand. No, it is vocabulary that they will need to be able to read, complete the reading or listening tasks. Now, how do we know what vocabulary to pre-teach? It's very simple. You need to read the text yourself when you're doing your lesson planning. You need to look at the different questions that are posed, that the course book or the materials already come along with. So those questions, you need to read those questions, you need to read the answers to those questions, and then see what vocabulary they may need to be able to answer those questions. I'll give you an example. If the text is about jogging, and they will definitely need to know what jog or jogging is, especially at lower levels when they have a much reduced vocabulary. Now, that's the pre-skills stage. So you have your lead-in, your warmer, and you pre-teach vocabulary. Now, if here in the lead-in, your activity, you may then make predictions and evoke key vocabulary, and you wrote their ideas and predictions up on the board, then you don't really need to pre-teach vocabulary. You have done already that at this stage. If you haven't done this, then one way of pre-teaching vocabulary may be having a picture and a word for them to match and if they do it successfully, that means the showing understanding of what that visual and that word are. And so that would be one possibility. Depending on the level, you can make it more difficult and then have a word and a definition for them to read and match. There are lots of different activities, but for the time being, it is important that you see what the stages are. Now, the next stage is wild skills stage. So now we are really going to try and help them develop their receptive skills. So what the next activity that we would normally have is a skimming for gist activity or a listening for gist activity. Gist means general understanding. So is in a natural way, when we approach a text, we want to get a general idea before we actually look at the text in detail. So we give them a gist task, whether it is skimming or listening for gist. We then have them pair and share together, pair and check, and then feedback before we move on to the next stage, which would be reading the same text or listening to the same text in more detail, and then that would be scanning for details or listening for details. Now, here we can say details may be a single item, as in some literature it is talked about as specific information. And so an example would be, when was he born? 1919. What color were his eyes? Blue. What color was his hair? Black. Where did he live? Paris. So single item, specific information, item or items. Or details, many pieces of information. So for example, why did he win the election? Number 1, because he was the tallest candidate. Number 2, he was the richest candidate. Number 3, his father had been a former president. Number 4, he had the most votes, etc., etc. Now, in one 40-minute lesson, obviously, we want to try and have them develop or work on their skimming for gist or listening for gist skills, scanning for or listening for specific for details, whether it is specific information or details or both. One possibility, because there are many other soft skills, would be that of making or drawing inferences. So obviously that's when you detect bias, for example, or reading between the lines. Now, this is not always possible, so that's why it says whenever the text allows it or it is suitable for that specific text. Now, one possibility would be asking just one single question. Read the first time for gist, the second time for details, the third time read again and answer a question, a drawing inferences question. For example, read again and say whether the author is in favor of or against, or do you think Marco in the reading or in the listening is happy? Why not? So they need to read between the lines. Now, again, this is not always possible. If this is not possible, then there are other soft skills, like, for example, dealing with unknown vocabulary. Some books have specific exercises that come after this reading, and obviously this, as a strategy, is basically dealing with language. However, it is obviously a receptive skills soft skill. While on the course, you are highly likely to mainly focus on just skimming for gist and scanning for details and specific information, and possibly drawing inferences, nothing more really. Now, the last stage, that brings us to the last stage in a receptive skills lesson, which is the Postskills. Now, I call it extension. Lots of trainers call it the extension stage, but other trainers just call it the Postskills stage. The name doesn't really matter. The important thing is that at this stage you do Postskills. What does that mean? That here you want a natural reaction to the text they read or to the text they listened to in spoken or written form. Okay, so they talk about it or they write about it. Why? If you read an article or listen to something in the news and it really makes an impression on you, what is the natural reaction? You go and talk to someone, you say, oh, did you hear what happened on the news, what they said in the news, or did you read their article in the newspaper, and that's this way, or it's horrible, or I love it. So that reaction is the natural reaction we want from students at this stage. And then obviously you would be listening to them to give them some reading, some feedback, and possibly some error correction. So that is a receptive skills lesson. Now let's look at language lessons. In language lessons, I've put together here, I've two different frameworks. You have here in the middle presentation, practice, production, or the famous PPP, and guided discovery. The reason for this is that the PPP framework is very popular. And the reason for guided discovery is that it is very, very student-centered. And I think, and I personally think it is probably one of the best in terms of student engagement and making the students use their brain and do things on their own, and have everybody hands-on and experimenting with language. Now, let's look at the stages for the PPP, presentation, practice, production lesson framework. Remember, we're talking about language, so this would be a lesson where the focus of the lesson is either just grammar. For example, you are teaching the present simple, or vocabulary. For example, you're teaching vocabulary related to food or vegetables or sports or functions, asking for advice, asking for permission, making polite requests, etc. Or pronunciation, connected speech, or different specific sounds, etc. So each lesson would have, language lesson would have one of these as the main focus. Now, again, you would have a lead-in, a warmer. We already talked about that. In the presentation, practice, production, the first stage would be your presentation, and where you deal with MFPU, meaning, form, pronunciation, and use. In this stage, what you want to do is try and be as student-centered as possible, so that your presentation is not you talking about language. That's one of the big mistakes people make. And very often people are very teacher-centered. Students get bored. They're passively listening to you babbling about grammar or lexis or functional pronunciation. So the idea is that you use the content here to introduce new target language. Think of an engaging and student-centered way to introduce it. Give and check instructions, then pair and share before feedback, and make sure you have plenty of CCQs or concept checking questions to check that they understand what the meaning is. Okay, and the form and the pronunciation and the use of the target language. This is obviously in this order. You would be probably addressing meaning first before we actually look at form or the grammar or the structure. Make sure you ask questions that elicit evidence of their understanding of the form. For example, point their attention to the target language. An example would be, is it a noun? Look at the word on the board. Is it a noun? Is it an adjective? Is it a verb? How do you know? Just asking, do you understand, doesn't mean anything and doesn't help. And just asking, is it a verb? Yes or no? Just because they say yes or no is not indication of understanding. So be very careful about that. Once we've covered meaning and form, then we want to very briefly work on pronunciation. So in your lesson planning, you need to work out the difficult words to pronounce and drill them. You need to think about the difficult words for them, for the students. What are the difficult words? One quick example is the difference between bed and bad. For Italian speakers, they sound the same, and so they would probably say, oh, I'm having a bad day, instead of a bad day. You use phonemic script for these and point out stress shift from noun to adjective if necessary. This is just an example. So you're addressing MFPU. Okay, in the presentation. Now, the next stage, obviously, once you've presented your target language, now we want them to practice it. in a controlled way to see if they can use it accurately. So control practice activities to see if students are using the target language accurately. You monitor, obviously, while they do that. You give instructions, you check instructions, they do it, pair and share, and then feedback and error correction. Then that leads us to the last stage of the lesson, which would be production. And in production, basically what we want to do is give them more freedom than what we gave them here. So here is freer practice activities to make students use the target language fluently. So we're not so much concerned with how accurate they use it, but how fluently they use it. Again, you set up the task, give instructions, check them, feedback, error correction. Okay, now let's move on. Let's look at the guided discovery then. Still, let's say that it is the same lesson, grammar, but in a more student-centered way. So you would still have your lead-in, your warmer. Again, if you make them make predictions and evoke key vocabulary, then you may not need a pre-teach vocabulary stage if you deal with that vocabulary here and they're making their predictions here. If you don't, then that stage would be pretty much the same as here. Teacher sets a task for students to predict what information the text, spoken or written, may contain. Remember the example. Okay, so when was the last time you went to a restaurant? Where is that restaurant? Why do you like that restaurant? Okay, then you say, okay, we're going to read a text about a restaurant, or we're going to listen to a text about a restaurant. What do you think they're going to talk about? In pairs, they can talk, and then you get feedback from them and write their ideas and predictions up on the board in preparation for the next task. Why do we write those ideas up on the board? Because this is basically the introduction to the gist task or skimming task. Because then this gives them a purpose for listening or reading. You can then now say, okay, now to get the main idea of the reading or the listening text, I'm going to give you a very short or limited time, 1 or 2 minutes, depending on how long the text is, to read very quickly or to listen to the text and check if your predictions here were correct or if your predictions here were correct. That gives them a purpose for listening. However, it's not the only way. You can, instead of doing these predictions, you can give them just one question. Read the text or listen to the text and answer the question. That would be a gist listening or a skimming question or task. Now, once they've done that and they know the text and the context and they've read it at least once and they got the general idea, or listened to the text at least once and they have a general idea, then we look at the heart of the lesson. This is the heart of the lesson, the guided discovery part. Okay, so very, very important, because in the guided discovery stage, the most important part of the lesson, what they're going to be doing is basically experimenting with the language. Now, what is the guided discovery? It's a series of questions that students can work on their own, in pairs, in groups, that guide them in understanding language issues of MFPU. This can take the form, or usually takes the form, of a worksheet. Basically, here in the presentation practice production, you have concept checking questions that you're asking orally to the students and about the meaning, the form, the pronunciation. You're asking them orally, right? So here, this is mainly done orally. And the problem with that is that the interaction, the ratio is teacher student is basically teacher. If you have 12 students, it's going to be 12 times you and only 1 time each student. So the ratio of interaction is very high for teachers. So it's not very good, because it means everybody else is going to be listening, waiting, etc. With guided discovery, these questions, you don't ask them orally. You put them in a worksheet, and individually or in pairs, they work. So you have 10, 15 students working, using their brain at one given time rather than listening to you and then waiting for their turn to interact or maybe give you one answer. So here you are off stage. The stage is for the students. This can take the form of a worksheet. These are the questions you would ask orally to the whole group if following a PPP approach or framework. The difference is that students work individually, in pairs, or in groups. Here, actively involved rather than answering your questions one by one. Now, let's move on. Then, once you've done your guided discovery, again, while they're busily working on that, what happens? You are listening to them, gathering information so that you can give them feedback or clarify language before the end. So teacher runs whole class feedback, clarifying further any of the problems they had here with MFBU if necessary. As with presentation, practice, production, PPP, after the presentation, after the language work, we do some practice. Same stage, see? There are lots of similarities. So control practice activities, and to see if students are using the target language accurately, same thing. We give them here a control practice activity to see if they're using the language accurately. Students carry out activities where the answers are predictable. That's why they're controlled. And set, for example, students rank vocabulary items, fill in gaps, transform sentences, select the correct tense, etc. In the meantime, you are monitoring and gathering information for feedback and error correction. As with PPP, the next stage would be giving them more freedom, so freer practice activities, but to make the students use the target language more fluently. And these activities are more open-ended, so definitely not that control. Again, you monitor, gather information so that you can get feedback and error correction. Okay, so now, moving on, let's recap rather quickly. So you identified the focus of your lesson, then you identified the framework that you want to use, whether it is skills or language, whether it is PPP or guided discovery. Now, the next two steps are very simple. Number 3, identify the content of your teaching practice. I'm teaching grammar, great. But what grammar is it? Is it the present perfect? Is it the present simple? Is it cleft sentences? Is it the past progressive? What is the grammar aspect that you're going to be addressing? So you need to know exactly what, so that you do your language analysis on that area. If you're teaching a skills lesson, then what is it that you're doing? Is it reading? Is it listening? And if it is reading or listening, you know that you have very few and very set soft skills to develop. They're going to be skimming, scanning, and possibly drawing inferences about the text. Okay. Finally, step number 4. No, sorry, before we finish here. So remember, you need to remember, you still need to identify the content, so the language in the text, to be able to research or analyze it. Remember that with every lesson plan, you need to research your content for your TP, and you need to produce or complete a full-blown language analysis, or a full-blown skills analysis, depending on what it is that you're teaching. Finally, you can start planning only after having identified the stages above. It's only 4 steps. So 1, 2, 3, 4 quick steps. That way, the structure of your lesson plan will be correct, and filling in these stages first, and then thinking about how you're going to deliver them more carefully and how it all hangs together will definitely make your planning easier. So thank you very much for listening, and all the best with your teaching practice, and I'm sure you will be great, and you will feel a little bit more confident whenever you approach your next TP.